Thank you, Lisette. Thank you, Greg, and thank you to the Center for Latin American Studies for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be back on campus. I've been stuck out in D.C. for 2 years now, and as I was saying to people here earlier, it's just so lovely to be back on Berkeley campus because it's so weird, right? Just everything is it's far too square on the other coast. Okay, so I'm going to be, the presentation, as Lisette says, that I'm going to give today draws on my 2018 book, Mortal Doubt, which is published with University of California Press. And the book explores the crisis of peacetime violence that's been taking place in Guatemala and the northern triangle of Central America more generally. And I'm going to take on this peacetime violence or extreme peacetime violence through the lens of the maras, or transnational gangs, which are the region's most visible violent actors. Now these gangs' evolution, modus operandi, and phantasmagoric place in the collective imaginary makes them useful guides for trying to peel back the layers of violent history, structural violence, and mediatic spectacle that have come to, that feed into the making extreme insecurity and that sort of populate popular imaginations well beyond Central America, because this is very much an international phenomenon. So I'm going to use a variety of photos, most of which I shot myself, and some of which are quite graphic, so trigger warning. But it's necessary, I think, because so much of what we come to understand of gang violence and what's happening in the region more generally comes through spectacle. And I'm going to try to unpack this spectacle on multiple scales. The scenes and stories I invoke are drawn from extensive field work in Central American cities, mostly Guatemala City, as well as in prisons, police stations, gang-dominated neighborhoods. Most of that I started fieldwork in 2010 and spent years living in Guatemala City and have been going back periodically ever since. They're also drawn from regional and international news cycles, focused on Central America. So it's a Central American story, but under the present administration here in the United States, transnational gangs, especially the Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, have once again become central to U.S. politics as well. And something that struck me is, it's not surprising, but I think it's still important to understand the role that the gangs play in providing a sense of order to the chaos that is taking place in Central America is being refashioned and readapted here through the lens of anti-immigrant politics in the U.S. So in conversation, I want to circle back to this issue at the end of my talk. And I would ask you to keep these transnational echoes and reflections in mind as we move through the history, spaces, businesses, and spectacularized violence that have made the maras what they are today. Okay, so without further ado. On February 14th, 2012, a fire ripped through Comayagua prison in Honduras, and 377 inmates were burned alive. More than half of Comayagua's inmates were in pretrial detention, still awaiting their day in court. Along with horrific images of bodies split open like sausages and anguished family members gathered at the prison walls, rumors quickly surfaced that elements in the Honduran security forces started the fire. Prison guards reportedly shot at prisoners attempting to escape the blaze, and the conflagration was a third of its kind in 7 years, as well as the deadliest. When the news hit the airwaves, I was on my way to court in the Tower of Tribunals in Guatemala City. And riding up in the elevator, a prosecutor turned to his colleague. "It's a message from God," he exclaimed. "What a shame we don't do it like that here. We could finally be done with the gang filth and their extortions." The next day, I sat with a former MS-13 leader named Wande in a prison outside of Guatemala City, judging a Valentine Day card contest organized by a gang rehabilitation organization for which I volunteered. The 3 finalist creations featured Tweety Bird, Tigger, and a sad little blonde boy. While the winners collected their prizes, Wande pored over front-page photographs of the charred dead, like the one I just showed you. I recounted the conversation I had overheard, and Wande sat mulling it over, and then he cracked a sad smile. "They think they can burn the devil out," he said. "But wouldn't that mean setting fire to the whole world?" So maras, or transnational gangs, first took root in Central America nearly 30 years ago, just as the region's Cold War conflicts were ending. At the time, they were little more than disorganized groups of youth imitating Los Angeles-born Latino gangs vying for turf in cities struggling to recover from authoritarian rule. But over the years, they've evolved into brutal organizations engaged in extortion, contract killings, and the drug trade. Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18 are the 2 most powerful and well-known and most visible maras in Central America, and feuds between them have helped to turn the region into the deadliest non-combat zone in the world. At the same time, maras and mareros, or gangsters, with their penchant for conspicuous tattoos and audacious violence, have become archetypal symbols of all that's gone wrong in Central America. I didn't take this photograph. This is one I'm sure you probably recognize if you look at gangs at all. This is sort of the circulated image of what gangs are. And I'll try to unpack that a little bit later. So it's more, and as I'm going to discuss today, the gangs in Central America become central to both the politics of imprisonment and the politics of death in Central America and beyond. So I arrived in Guatemala City in 2010 to begin field research that I hoped would penetrate the haze of fear and fantasy swirling about the maras. In fact, I did so on a Center for Latin American Studies grant. All right, just a shout out. So along with other cities in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, this metropolis of some 7 million citizens has suffered under the gang phenomenon, and its poor neighborhoods, its sprawling suburbs, as well as the nation's overcrowded prison system. And in this city, as in other cities across the region, the rise of the maras has been concomitant with the onset of a new kind of insecurity. And this is not the overtly political and ethnic violence of prior epochs, which killed some 150,000 people and disappeared more than 45,000. Today, Guatemala City, instead, is a time and place dominated by both the fact and the fear of out-of-control crime. So, following the sign of peace accords in 1996, the nation's homicide rate jumped to 40 per 100,000, fifth highest in the world. And between 2000 and 2008, Guatemala City homicides doubled, with the numbers climbing to as high as 60 per 100,000. And in the city's red zones, which are poor, insecure neighborhoods, often dominated by gangs or other organized criminal groups, security officials claim that homicide rates shoot up to over 190 per 100,000. If you compare that, the murder rate in the US is around 3 or 4 per 100,000. But in a sense, these sorts of body counts do more to obscure than they do reveal. As hard and fast as the numbers may seem, what makes this violence so terrifying is its profound uncertainty. Less than 5% of violent crimes are ever make it to trial, making Guatemala a great place to commit murder. Forces of order and disorder often make distorted reflections of each other. At best, the law appears helpless, and at worst complicit, making the list of usual suspects in every murder, extortion, kidnapping, what have you, long and badly defined. And police regularly exchange places with the criminals that they're meant to bring to justice. Massacre, torture, and dismemberment are also popular techniques to make murder register far and wide. And the cacophony of public reaction, sensationalist media reporting, politicians grandstanding, the rumors that course through violence-stricken communities warps the fear into every realm of public life. Thus, Guatemala City, like so many other cities in the world today, is one of those spaces dominated by what Hannah Arendt would call the all-pervading unpredictability of violence. In the contemporary world, such spaces are legion. Since the end of the Cold War, the so-called democratic wave and the triumph of market fundamentalism has been accompanied by a gradual erasure of received lines between the informal and the illegal, regulation and irregularity, order and organized lawlessness. This is especially so in Central America's Northern Triangle, where states have become criminal, criminals counterfeit the state, and those caught in the middle are left to muddle through as best they can. With so many murders left unsolved and unpunished, overwhelming doubt haunts collective perceptions of danger and mires every avenue of investigation. So, as a veteran homicide investigator with the National Civil Police told me, a death may occur for failure to pay extortion. A death, well, it may occur because of a drug-related settling of accounts and have nothing to do with the gangs. And that's all one can say. And from behind his cluttered desk, he fixed me with an incongruous grin and said, "You might die because your brother got caught up with the maras. Who can say with more specificity? There are many acts that have such consequences." Extreme levels of violence arising from such inscrutable sources cast long shadows over Guatemala City. Violence and its terror dictate how residents think and live, and people cast about for ways of making sense of what has become a war without sense. These struggles to make sense of senselessness, to draw meaning and certainty out of cycles of violence that refuse to be fixed in time and place, converge upon the figure of the marero, the transnational gang member. Actors of all kinds draw on this figure to make meaning in political discourse, newspaper and TV headlines, casual conversation and rumors, and in daydreams and nightmares. For Guatemalans from all walks of life, this figure has come to personify all the wounds and illnesses of the struggling social body and thrust into the public imagination. The symbolic power of the Marero fuses everyday violence taking place in gang territories and other insecure spaces to the making of social and political perspectives dictating life across a city, the nation, and beyond, and I would say increasingly in the US as well. However, you should keep in mind that the Mara, this public enemy number one, is not a discrete thing separable from structures of violence that trespass the blurred boundaries linking the world to the underworld upon which it rests. So I showed you this image before, and this is really through a lot of national and transnational media, I think this has become sort of the face that we associate with Maras. You think of transnational gangs, MS-13, tatted up guys behind prison, encaged somehow. But there's also this version of the gangs. Right? These are the wives, sisters, mothers, lovers, cousins of imprisoned gang members who are accused of being part of an extortion network directed from inside prison but carried out by these women. Or this face of the Mara. It's an isolation block in one of the prisons I worked in, visiting day for incarcerated Mareros. Or this face of the Mara. This picture was taken, this gentleman was 19 years old. And he has a sort of typical face of the Marero. He's from Barrio 18, 18th Street. But what fascinates me about this picture, this is in his cell, are these little figurines, the dolls that he keeps for his daughter's visit, and most particularly this self-portrait he made of himself with his 4-year-old daughter. And the way his own face is that same mask, but his daughter's face has this beautiful humanity to it. So like savage others, raised up through history and across cultures, the Mara's image expresses and shrouds and eclipses the complex structural and historical forces that make the catastrophic present so deeply uncertain, becoming another justification for savagery in the name of law and order promised by so-called civilization. They're foot soldiers in a vague and dystopian civil war. They're inhuman and unfeeling killers who do not fear death. They're youth trying to protect themselves or maybe just get some style. They're boys struggling to become men, parasites feeding off of collective fear, byproducts of consumer capitalism, and souls lost along a blazing path into an ungodly future. For some, the Mara's willingness to kill and die have made them useful mercenaries following the orders of higher powers, doing the dirty work of corrupt police, who in turn are protecting the political elite, organized crime, and the wealthy that are intent upon maintaining the status quo above all else. For others, gangs are simply an ugly expression of a collective fall from grace and loss of traditional values. So when I asked a man named Walter Villatoro, who was a well-respected criminal circuit judge in Guatemala, why Maras had become so violent, he said, well, he was like, aha! I will tell you, we've become rotten from the beginning. It starts with cesarean sections, the separation of child from mother, feeding newborns animal milk, and leaving them alone in their cribs. The gangs are the vomit of a sick society. So in short, these brash vehicles of violence and emissaries of peacetime violence have become absolutely essential to the making of a certain kind of order. Maras form a vital node, a flashpoint, if you will, in which overwhelming violence and fear circulating throughout the social body comes into stark relief. They are, in a sense, a way for people to know violence and its terror, or at least a way of providing a discernible form to the endless unknowns that make living under such circumstances so terrifying. They become means of rendering the illegible legible, of imposing a sense of finitude and control onto out-of-control insecurity. They become the answer when no answer is enough. In a world that always appears to be coming undone, the Maras play a pivotal role in holding it together. So, at the heart of Mortal Doubt, the book's title, and you can see this sort of this thread of doubt running throughout my discourse. It's the endless enmeshing between the imagining and the making of the world. Through history, spaces, businesses, and violent spectacles through which the Mara phenomenon has evolved, I try to trace the promiscuous exchange between the material, what the gangs do, the kinds of violence, actual physical violence they take part in, and the symbolic, how they are framed in the media, politics, everyday conversation. And I show how flesh and blood violence is indissoluble from their power in social imaginaries, and how they provide cover for a host of actors feeding off severe insecurity. To this end, the marero who walks the streets and the marero infesting strung-out imaginations blend and merge in ways that make them difficult, if not impossible, to draw apart. And more than this, the Mara's become a means of interrogating the making and mooring of collective fear in Guatemala City, the region, and beyond. All right, so just a little bit overview. I'm going to, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to dip into different parts of the book. And so I'll give you an overview of sort of what the whole structure looks like so you can have a roadmap. So part one of the book is called Truths and Fictions. It maps the circulation of rumors, fantasies, and outright lies and how we've come to imagine the Maras and the violence they represent, exploring the promiscuous exchange between experience and artifice in the making of gang history. Part two, which I will highlight today, it's called Worlds and Underworlds, and expands out from the Maras into the prison system and into the city to show how a myriad of actors from the state, private businesses, military men, among others, feed off the struggle to impose order on peacetime violence. And finally, part three, Spectacle, Structure, and Agency, explores how the spectacle of gang violence is produced and consumed on national and global scales, and the ways that makes accomplices, even the most distant witnesses, and undermines the very possibility of innocence for any of us. All right. So I'm going to draw from, oops, there we go. I want to take up the ethical, political, and existential stakes implicit in Wande's initial observation. If the devil, so to speak, can't be trapped in the prisons, then where is he to be found? In the details, no doubt. And so before I scale up to discuss the causes and consequences of the violence the gangs have come to represent so powerfully, if you allow me, I'd like to give you a glimpse of some of the ethnographic exchanges that produce these stories. A little tiny vignette from the book. Okay. Guatemala City, May 2012. Calavera eases open the door and eyes the street he grew up on. Blurred figures slip beyond his peripheral vision down an alley. Children from the neighborhood, or perhaps not, tinkling laughter, nothing to fear. Then again, he knows well enough the demons lurking in children's smiles. They make the best lookouts, watching, just watching they go. And didn't Casper once call you his little chucho? Just let the dog off the chain and see. Across the street, the tiendita he knew as a child has been painted blue, Tigo stenciled in white block letters. His own Mara Salvatrucha tag is somewhere beneath those layers of paint. And behind the tiendita's black metal grate, a small girl sits on a stool among Doritos and Lay's potato chip bags strung up like bait fish among sacks of fried pigskin, plantain chips, and swaddle for babies sick with fever. A refrigerator glows behind her, brown glass bottles sweating within, and beside the refrigerator, used rusted propane canisters are stacked like ordnance from a forgotten war. The girl watches the street without blinking, her lips pulled back in a half smile, gold teeth glinting in the sunlight slanting over the tin rooftops. I stand before the arches of the cemetery entrance, waiting for Calavera. I have a small silver voice recorder, a camera, and a journal in a green U.S. Army satchel. Flower vendors clog the sidewalk. The scent of carnations and roses wilting in piles filters through the stench of burning garbage on the breeze. Further down the boulevard, the city morgue is abuzz. Men in white lab coats haul forensic equipment in and out. A line of silent visitors stretches out onto the sidewalk, waiting to identify the recently dead. Funeral home operators, wearing dark glasses and tattered blazers, linger among the aggrieved, handing out business cards. A month from now, I will pose as a mourner and come to find the body of a young man named Andy. Government officials will not answer my queries. 8 years ago, Calavera stood here holding his sister's hand as she waited to identify her murdered husband. Then, as now, coffin makers and stonemasons bend their labors across the boulevard, their hammers echoing through the traffic. I mull over my plan, walk with Calavera to his brother's grave, record his memories of growing up, his brother's death, and their time running with the Mara Salvatrucha. Calavera steps out and shuts the door quietly behind him. For a few heartbeats, he lingers, tracing in his memory the constellation of bullet holes above the door long plastered over. Then he's on the street watching the neighbor's shuttered windows as he walks. Few of his old compatriots remained who might recognize him, except for Casper, who hardly ever leaves his safe house in El Trebol. Still, Calavera wouldn't even have come here if he didn't long to see his sister and nieces. Quickening his pace, he walks past a handful of boys kicking a rumpled blue plastic ball. They stop their game and watch him disappear down a cement footpath, winding beneath electricity wires strung like sad nets to catch the falling sky. So, I first met the character that I call Calavera when he was finishing out a 6-year sentence for drug transport in Pavon Prison, which is Guatemala's oldest and largest prison facility. And I went to prison to understand the maras. This is where criminal bodies are preserved. In the words of many people I know who, many active and ex-gang members have ended up in prison, they say they survive because they're in prison, because life on the street, people get killed so fast. And in any case, prisons help make the maras, and maras are a perfect example of the world that prisons make. Over the years of conducting research behind bars, I also learned that prison life can provide a powerful means of observing social relations and political dynamics that order life beyond prison walls and beyond maras too. So in the last 30 years, humans have built more prisons and incarcerated more people than in any other time in human history. Driving the surge in imprisonment are a set of harsh but very simple arguments. One, criminals must be quarantined to protect the social body from the contagion of crime. 2, their suffering is payment for their sin. And 3, a warning to others who would consider breaking the law. In this way, prisons are not merely concrete structures for warehousing criminalized bodies. They're also invested with powerful political and social meaning essential to the functioning of many modern societies, especially our own. Prisons, by our own, I mean U.S. society. Prisons help create a sense of order against a gnawing sense of uncertainty and insecurity, built to serve the ideals of certainty, classification, hard and fast boundaries. They etch these ideals into the social body. That such ideals are false idols doesn't stop the institution from carving into prisoners' flesh and into public consciousness the notion that the so-called good really can be distinguished from the evil, feeding the fantasy of clearly defined categories of personhood. For legal classifications of innocence and guilt tend to elide all sorts of factors driving social conflict, including historical inequality and contemporary conditions of violation. Overwhelmingly, the evil, quote unquote, are drawn from society's poorest and most marginalized populations. And so prisons are spaces and symbols in and through which deep socioeconomic inequalities abiding in prejudice and power dynamics defining contemporary life are distilled and become all too visible. Now, much has been written about how essential prisons are for providing a sense of security, even as they do not, by and large, actually make society safer. And this is especially so in Guatemala and other parts of Central America, where belief that prisons could actually quarantine criminals and protect society is widely understood as a misbegotten fallacy. Collective rage and frustration over Central American states' failure to actually punish evildoers, which may have fueled the Comayagua fire that I described earlier and certainly inspired celebratory reactions like the one I overheard, belie how deeply implicated such prejudice and institutions of punishment are with the rise of peacetime crime. Case in point, the penal state has been an unwitting midwife to the maras metamorphosis. So for mareros, prison has long been both an expected way station and a central point of organization and cultural reproduction. So beginning in the late 1990s, to give you a little history, and growing into the early 2000s, Guatemala was caught up in the regional hysteria over the unprecedented growth of post-Cold War crime. Pantomiming Honduras and El Salvador, the Guatemalan government organized a massive assault on the gang threat, which resulted in the arrest of thousands of poor urban youth. Some were bona fide gangsters, but the vast majority were not. And so by the early 2000s, prisons in Guatemala, as in Honduras and El Salvador, were packed full of mareros alongside young men who became easy fodder for gang recruitment as they took on the group identity foisted upon them by police profiling and just tried to survive. They found themselves trapped behind bars fighting for survival against rival prisoner factions. And for a time, rival gangs learned to cooperate with each other to survive the ebb and flow of the constant game of tug of war between prisoner factions and agents of the state. Imprisoned gang leaders formed the first so-called wheel of the barrio, or rueda del barrio, through which the most powerful ranfleros, or leaders, met and coordinated trade in weapons, soldiers, and territorial claims on the outside. Now, surviving leaders of these gangs even claim to have ordered homies on the street to intentionally get arrested in order to gain numerical dominance in various prisons. Such strategies help make the Maras a force to be reckoned with throughout the prison system. So the Maras' success in disrupting established systems of rule in the prisons was based on their ability to coordinate across prison walls. Like the infrastructure of any border, prison walls form a porous membrane across which all sorts of exchange, both licit and illicit, take place. And while the Maras spectacularly expose how deeply the state relies upon the underworld to keep functioning, they are rich in varied company. Prison guards and prisoners' lovers, the media, military men, up to the very highest echelons of government feed upon the prison for power, for profit, or merely to survive. So I only have time for 2 examples of how this sort of exchange between life inside a prison and life outside the prison, between the incarcerated and the so-called free, undermine the ideals of isolation and containment the prison is meant to uphold. So first I'm going to talk about the everyday nature of this through la visita, or prison visitors, the vast majority of whom are women supporting their incarcerated husbands, lovers, and sons. So in Guatemala, as in many parts of Latin America, and actually in the United States as well, to a degree that I think most people don't understand, the women that support incarcerated men play integral roles in both formal and informal prison dynamics. They're objects of new forms of state surveillance and key connections between imprisoned gang leaders and their street networks. They provide crucial care for imprisoned populations while risking their bodies smuggling contraband. And they also suffer the repercussions of increasingly punitive penal regimes driven by the war on drugs on poor urban communities the world over. In short, they're both active agents and vital vectors in a carceral continuum that blurs any hard and fast distinctions between the inside and the outside of prison. And so, conjugal visits, known in prison jargon as la visita, drive the Guatemalan prison system. Impelled by a mix of need and devotion, every day hundreds of wives, girlfriends, and sex workers queue up outside prisons throughout the country. And the relationships with the men inside are absolutely essential to everyday prison life. These women play key roles in prison economies, moral ecologies, and fragile détentes between inmates and officials that constitute so-called prison order. Even as La Visita undermined the isolation that the prison is meant to impose upon its prisoners by smuggling drugs and other contraband, the woefully underfunded and radically overcrowded prison system depends upon the relief these women provide. Such exchange also undergirds the survival of the prison itself, providing prisoners with access to essential goods, from antibiotic ointment to marijuana, building materials to cell phones, that keep the entire system running. And in talking with prison directors in these places, I remember one conversation I'll never forget, where I was going into discussing with the prison director of Pavon Prison about all the contraband coming in. He said, "Look, I know how much marijuana gets smuggled in every day into my prison. But if I were to stop the flow today, I would have an immediate riot on my hands, and my guards would turn against me because they depend upon this flow in order to feed their families." Right? So when we talk about the sorts of corruption that actually maintain that sort of undermine the law and order system, it's this same corruption that actually holds it up as well. Okay, so the second example links prison power with the highest echelons of state power. Oops, these are a couple more La Visita pictures. The visiting day. It's the space for conjugal visits over there. All right. So a second example is this man, Capitan Byron Lima. And it shows how prison power links with the highest echelons of the state. The Maras' fight for survival and domination in prison put them in direct competition with powerful prisoner factions led by military men who had been involved in narco-trafficking or arrested for war crimes. This man in particular was arrested for the 1998 assassination of Archbishop Girardi, the Archbishop of Guatemala, after he had published, 3 days after the publishing of, by the Catholic Church, of the military's atrocities during the Civil War. Now, these groups of incarcerated military men leveraged their links with prison authorities to dominate all illicit businesses within the prison, taxing other prisoners and prison visitors, and acting as the de facto authority within prison walls. The most famous of these military prison kingpins was this guy, as I said, Captain Byron Lima, who was a former civil, arrested for, trained at the School of the Americas, Guatemalan Special Forces, and he was arrested, as I said, for the murder of Archbishop Girardi. Over a 20-year period, from around 2000 to when he was finally assassinated a couple years ago, he rose to dominate every prison in which he was incarcerated. Lima and his lackeys clashed with Mareros on numerous riots in the early 2000s, and Lima always came out on top. So before he was assassinated in 2016, I interviewed Lima several times, and it was always a trip going into his prison because he was in a place called Pavoncito prison, and this place had the whole sort of ramshackle Guatemalan state security on the outside, but as soon as you went on the inside, he had his own security guards, and these people actually had metal detectors and were very thorough, all military men, and he had total control over this prison. We went walking through. He had a guy guys with walkie-talkies walking point in front and behind us, and had essentially transformed this prison into his own empire. And they had a Pizza Hut, a Pollo Campero. They had if anyone, that's like the marquee Guatemalan fast food joint. Etc. So it was unlike any other prison I'd ever been to, and it was precisely due to this man's ability to draw upon wealthy support from the outside. He reached the height of his power. Lima reached the height of his power following the 2012 presidential elections, which put another civil, a man named Otto Perez Molina, in power. Lima was so close to the executive branch at this time that he managed to appoint 6 of the 7 subdirectors of the prison system, which he then used to control transfer of prisoners and the allocation of prison guards. For a time, he arguably ran much of the prison system while still an inmate, profiting enormously from bribes and kickbacks from rich prisoners whose fates he controlled. So he basically ran an extortion system. Anyone who came into his prison, he said, "You pay me or I'll make sure you get beaten every day." Based on his success in bringing order to the prisons in which he resided, he even dreamed of running for president. So, porous prisons dissolve any hard and fast boundaries dividing the incarcerated from the free, and revealing how deeply the state, the law-abiding world, and the underworld overlap one another, how illusory the dream of their separation in fact is. And such porous prisons bring the collective struggle for a sense of order into stark relief by revealing how violently carceral ideals clash with prison actualities. What's more, the melding of life on the inside and life on the outside mean that the brutalities of prison life, and it is a very brutal place, where conditions are ideal for the strong to violate the weak, and the most ruthless, like Capitan Lima, are often those who dominate, inevitably impact the free. So in the next section, I'm going to turn to the evolution of violence as spectacle, and the ways such spectacle blurs preconceived notions of guilty and innocent, drawing even the most distant witnesses into the vortex of violent crime. So woven into this discussion is an effort to address the consequences of a question posed by political theorist Judith Butler. This is the question: whose life, if extinguished, would be publicly grievable, and whose life would leave no public trace to grieve, or only a partial, mangled, and enigmatic trace? So I take on this question in spaces where levels of violent death have reached unprecedented heights, and where certain social types, especially the gangster, are considered thoroughly killable. Okay, so this is from the chapter Made for Media Murder. In July 2010, incarcerated leaders of the Mara Salvatrucha planned and ordered a quadruple murder and decapitation carried out by street operatives to protest the loss of prison privileges, the most important one being the loss of la visita. They had their visiting privileges cut off. The victims should have no relationship whatsoever to the Mara Salvatrucha or its rival Barrio 18. The leadership wanted the message pure, untainted by gang rivalries, because after all, it's relatively easy for the general population to dismiss murdered gangsters. But random victims strike fear because they could be you. The imprisoned leaders, in fact, wanted their message to go beyond Guatemala. Make it a global, the gang leader El Diabolico told gathered gang members. That is, perform an act of violence that gets taken up in the international news stream. That night, various Mata Salvatrucha cells culled 4 victims, all of them young men, from poor, insecure urban neighborhoods, and placed each head in a place of political, economic, or mediatic significance. All right, trigger warning here. This is one of those heads. This was an attempt to inscribe rage into the public sphere through the mutilation and exhibition of bodies chosen at random for execution. And as excessively callous as this act may appear, it draws from what has by now become a standard, even well-worn script. Murdered, mutilated bodies put on public display to communicate some message to some audience. It's true that Matas are active agents of such violence, engaging in this discourse to spectacular effect. The savviest and most powerful among them capitalize on their underlings' aspirations and capacities for violence to initiate the spectacle. But spectacles are not mere images or collections of images. They're produced through social interaction and relationships. And so rooting this public brutality in the Matas elides how the crucible of post-war Guatemala, alongside a global media hungry for violent sensation, has forged Matas into the very limit point of criminal violence. As Maderos continue to kill and die at astonishing rates, they have become kind of shorthand in the vernacular of peacetime brutality, and this has consequences. Their will to excessive violence cannot be disentangled from how Matas, as both source and target of murder, have come to more the floating sense of fear and uncertainty haunting post-war life. From indifference to horror, fascination to fatigue, made for media murder like T.S. Eliot's Magic Lantern throws the nerves and patterns on a screen, exposing collective conceptions of unjust suffering and deserved death that circulate throughout Central American societies and well beyond. To make their otherwise unremarkable victims matter, street operatives place the heads at various locations around the city in the early morning. And part of this is to, even this particular haircut, right, of shaved head of a young man, a poor young man, would be interpreted by the media, by the general population as it must have had something to do with the gangs. So they had to up the ante by playing on geographical differences. One was placed in front of a popular shopping mall, one at the entrance to the Congressional building, one at the fire station where journalists were known to congregate, and another in a middle-class neighborhood. With each head, they left a note addressing the government. One read simply, "No more impunity," in clumsy scrawl. Another complained of injustice in the prison system. Now, as both victims and perpetrators, Matas play a pivotal role in the discourse of suffering bodies. The media, the government, and the public use the figure of the Madero to anchor anxieties over violence that often appears to become unmoored from all sense and reason. Dead Madero bodies, or bodies labeled as such, have become central nodes through which a frightened public metabolizes a creeping sense of helplessness, confusion, and despair. So, as Nietzsche observed, what really arouses indignation against suffering is not suffering as such, but the senselessness of suffering. Madero's suffering is easily justified, easily made sense of, and murdered Maderos need not be mourned. Any sign of gang association, determined by myriad factors related to age, dress, geography, and so on, as I was saying about that earlier photograph, can make a victim unmournable. Thus, brutal spectacle becomes woven out of everyday structural and symbolic violence. For example, September 30th, 2011, my field notes. Today, like every other day, the first 3 pages of Nuestro Diario, which is Guatemala's most widely circulated newspaper, are dedicated to murder and violence of every kind. Dismembered bodies dredged up outside of Mixco. They kill a Madero, spelled out in huge capitals, and a close-up of the cadaver's tattoos. The faces of a woman and a girl child and a boy child on his bicep. Gabby, drawn in Gothic calligraphy, a gun on his belly. Somewhere else, the Santa Muerte. The headline claims he was the head of a gang that conducted extortion rackets, but the 100-word article contains nothing to back this up. The next page shows 2 separate massacres, 2 women killed with multiple gunshot wounds in Zone 5 of the capital, with a quote from a local business owner. Regrettably, some girls get involved with the gangs, and this kills them. A tortured, tattooed corpse immediately becomes a gangster's body, an extortionist's body. The body's intact, but the imagery robs the corpse of its human wholeness by showing only the tattoos, focusing in on these symbols of social subversion that for many Guatemalans are prima facie evidence of guilt. The other stories relate with no details at all the murders of 2 women with only a glib quote, linking the girls' deaths to association with gangs. It's the association that kills whoever the murderer might be. Bodies stained with Mara markings so intensely visible as killers and signs of social subversion make the violence they have come to represent more easily metabolized. As murder rates have risen beyond all previous levels, the collective struggle to create distance from so much death has pushed many victims into the same categories as the killers. These people, as the saying goes, must have been involved in something. The intensive symbolic labor to differentiate the image of the criminal as far as possible from oneself, as Teresa Caldera talks about, extends not only to perpetrators of violence but also to their victims. And over time, such elision has driven gang strategies. So sitting in a prison yard back in Pavon, an incarcerated Marta Salvatrucha member who I call Mo, who has 40 years left on his sentence, said this to me. Before, you could intimidate just with words, but then people didn't listen so much, so you really had to scare them. People today don't even pay attention if you kill someone with a shooting. It's just a lost bullet. Today you have to dismember and terrorize the people if you want to have power. So what are the ways that certain acts of violence and certain kinds of suffering register and gain power in the public sphere and others do not? In the crime of the four heads, for example, the Mara masqueraded as police and mimed military executions. They attached to these bodies messages: no more impunity, no more injustice, echoing human rights vernacular, language that has become central to collective efforts to resist environmental injustice, government corruption, and elite malfeasance. They made this suffering count by placing the heads outside of spaces already associated with violence. By masquerading as police come death squad, mouthing the refrain of rights, and speaking their grievances through innocent corpses, La Mara Salvatrucha took on multiple roles in this post-war pageantry. All this to make their demands heard and make murder matter amidst a cacophony of everyday violence, if only for an ephemeral media moment. However, they failed to break through into the global as they intended. This never made the international news. A stringer for Reuters in Guatemala tried to run this story, but his editors in the Mexico City office refused. The market for massacres, I guess, is cutthroat competitive. On a slow day, they require at least 10 undone bodies for a massacre in Central America to become internationally newsworthy. Less than that, and it's not a story worth telling. So these traces get us some ways towards understanding the consequences of collective elision of certain people's suffering. How failing to count certain deaths comes with dire repercussions. But there's still a lingering question that goes well beyond the gangs and their violence, a question that's not ceased to haunt me. As a researcher claiming some kind of expert knowledge of the human condition, as a writer and communicator of these tragedies, how to confront my own agency and role in pushing forward cycles of violence that in some way depend upon massive circulation before the public eye. So I don't have a definitive answer to this question, but the struggle to find one is worth exploring for a moment. So I'm going to end my talk with one more snippet from the book. This is La Descuartizada. Villanueva, Guatemala, August 2012. I've just finished interviewing the police chief of Villanueva. Late for another appointment, I'm trying to make my exit as politely as possible when he turns abruptly to his computer, a huge flat screen mounted behind him, and pulls up an image of a man's half-charred body lying face down in a wheelbarrow in the blazing sun, a broken length of pipe protruding from the anus. A half-dozen police are gathered in the background with only their black uniform pants and boots visible, and one man's latex glove. Then the police chief commences flipping images rapid fire across that giant screen, images from his personal database. There are smashed heads and headless bodies in San Jose Pinula Miners Prison when the Mara Salvatrucha broke a prison treaty, and in Pavoncito Prison when the Paisas rioted and killed a bunch of mareros. A pile of half-clothed male bodies, some of them headless, piled promiscuously on top of one another, and a severed head caught in a shaft of light in an otherwise pitch-black room. Many, many others flicker across the screen in a horrible blur. He shows me pictures taken from Zeta 200 cell phones of a man posing with a human heart in his hand, a dead 9-year-old boy, and ghoulish grins on decapitated heads lined up one next to the other. He flips through them quickly, occasionally turning to me with a grave expression as if I should understand, until he stops on the last image. A teenage girl, the photo labeled La Descuartizada, the dismembered girl. Her legs have been severed at the hips, her arms at the elbows, the stumps are layered with fat and muscle like meat in a butcher's shop, laid out on a blanket. The remains of her body seem to be glistening, and for a moment I imagine she is covered in tears, but then on closer inspection it turns out to be only rain or dew. I ask the police chief if he can give me the photos, and he responds with an appraising glance and a grin. Why not? I still have many of these photos hidden away on a hard drive. The last image, La Descuartizada, haunts me the most, and it's the one I know least about. The image's atrocious intimacy and the total lack of information provoke endless questions. Who did this and why? Was it personal? Did she suffer long before she died? Her hair has been clumsily shorn away, suggesting defilement before death. There are no visible wounds beside her missing limbs. There's hardly any blood. Did the killer or killers do this to her as a means of making someone who loved her suffer? Or was she chosen at random to become the bearer of some message to some third party in a contest of wills that had nothing to do with her? Or was she involved in some bad business? Did she cross the wrong ally or enemy and was in some sense an agent to her own disaster? My questions and my curiosity are accompanied by a surge of fascinated horror and a quickening of the pulse. The image of La Descuartizada, this anonymous unfortunate, has made me an erstwhile witness to a crime, the details of which I will never know, and now she is victim to my unkempt imagination. I am, like all witnesses distant and near, sucked into the vortex of the crime. Her image draws me in, and I can't help but become party to her violation. So I once thought to put La Descuartizada as a picture in my book, but the book's publishers will not allow it. Such images are, however, found easily enough on the internet, right? Accessible to all at the click of a button. And like La Descuartizada, their immediate impact is to paralyze, to undermine the capacity for language and even thought. The visceral and psychological shock of witnessing such an image is beneath and beyond words, and saying anything risks saying the wrong thing and deepening the subject's denigration in one's own complicity. But letting La Descuartizada's victimizers simply speak for themselves is also a form of complicity and would make me no better than a voyeur. Worse, it would be giving in to the power of violence and pain to silence and steal our voices. Through voice we have language, and through language the power to describe and gain some control of what counts as reality. Like legions of others whose violated bodies are forced before the public eye, La Descuartizada is a window into a world in which mere words spoken by mere people have lost their meaning. I have to make her mean something, or forfeit meaning-making altogether. But is it possible to do this without forcing upon her my own need for a sense of safety and certainty, participating once again in the alienating violence of our constant ordering of the world? Her absolute anonymity layers her image into the endless mosaic of nameless dead floating about the internet and infesting collective consciousness. Her violation represents an endgame of human callousness. The image of her ruined body captures hell incarnate, but the details of her story remain out of reach. This photograph flattens the particularities of her life and her death into the vague and overwhelming horror of the world. Like so many others, she emerges before our eyes shorn of history and of place. In the erasure of her stories, dreams, hopes, and fears, perhaps she can be translated into a means of connection beyond the intellect and beneath the categories of difference that so deeply divide humans from one another. No matter how indistinct and untranslatable our experience on this earth may seem from those of distant others, we remain irrevocably linked through the undeniable fact of our bodies. This would be kinship through awareness of carnality. So the violation of the human body has a visceral, irrational, and irrevocable quality about it. It is a bedrock under all the layers of the horrible things that human beings do to one another. But in the end, I don't know how to bridge the yawning abyss that La Descuartizada exposes, that undermines any attempt to draw some kind of universal truth out of such horror. Even my own attempt to do so signals my remarkable privilege, reifying an irrevocable distance and disjuncture. I'm a white, uneducated, comfortably middle-class male citizen of the United States, whose power and freedom emerge from out of the self-same histories that make La Descuartizada's suffering possible in the first place. Her image makes me face myself. And to honestly face La Descuartizada means to come up against the very limits of our fears and desires about our own vulnerability, personal and bodily dignity and mortality. The degrees of separation between her and me are vast and innumerable, and yet I can find no reason or argument that justifies her violation and my safe, secure well-being. It's by pure chance that I was born into a place from which I may witness her destruction and not the other way around. And it's precisely this irrevocable distance that makes my speech possible, and her violation so absolute. She cannot speak. They have stolen what words she might have spoken. Who can give them back? Across an arbitrary and absolute divide, her image screams. It is deafening and encased in silence. Thank you. So I suppose it's question time, but we can take a second. Yeah, and then back there.
It seems like a lot of people were really willing to share certain things with you, like the police officer showing such graphic images, and even some of the prisoners showing you their collection of items. Was it easy to make those connections, or how did that process look?
Not easy. I mean, ethnographic research of this nature with clandestine organizations, how do I say it? Studying extreme violence is like, it's like studying, in some ways, like studying a black hole, right? How do physicists study a black hole? Well, you can't go near it because it sucks in all the light. So you have to study how light moves around it. And so I had to find sort of indirect tangential entrances into this. So one of the major mechanisms was volunteering with prisoner rehabilitation organizations, evangelical organizations, some NGOs that allowed me a regular entrance. It's one of the reasons the prison became such an important space, because life on the street is too insecure, and I could get access to certain neighborhoods at certain times because I always had a gatekeeper, but that access could disappear. My gatekeeper could get arrested or killed or run out of town or whatever it was. And so a lot of it was just hanging out for a while in prison. I spent 3 months just playing basketball, refusing blunts that were getting passed around, and helping out at barbecues and that kind of thing, until people sort of, and then undergoing the constant barrage, like, are you CIA, are you FBI, are you DEA, et cetera. And being entirely honest about what I was doing there, but also not, the other thing is the code switching, I guess you'd call it, between, talking to prisoners and talking to members of the police force, and trying to keep those lines of questioning separate from each other. But by and large, I mean, anyone who's done ethnographic fieldwork of any kind, I'm constantly surprised by how much people want to tell their stories, right? And especially guys who, these guys know the score. They know that they're not getting out of prison, or they're not going to live. I think something like 20% of Mareros live past 22, right? And that's off the cuff, but it's a lot. They know they're not going to survive. So the chance to tell their story to someone who's an outsider, who's not from their world, who wants to listen, who cares, often wasn't just enough for people to try to to open up, knowing that their story might make it beyond where they are. And it's in many ways one of the reasons that people join gangs in the first place, is to have a space, to have some sort of dignity in the world. So that, dangling that promise that I would tell their story was often a very attractive option for a lot of people. But it's at this point in time, it's become really difficult, because so many of the people I work with they've died, they get transferred out of prisons. Like, and sometimes I'm like, was I ever there? Right? Yeah.
My question is, to what degree do these gangs control the government?
Right.
Because for me, it
Right.
seems like the natural extension they want to take over.
Right. Well,
It seems like one guy wanted to run for president.
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, the level of fusion between major criminal organizations and state governments across the region is, it's not complete. It is deep. They're deeply intertwined. So you can't pull apart the state from the underworld. You can't do it. That said, for all their spectacle and all the attention they get, the gangs are probably on lower end of the totem pole in terms of actually, you get Mata Salvatrucha 18th Street, in terms of actually being able to control upper echelons of government. It's a whole different story if you're talking about drug trafficking organizations, right? You don't become president in any of these countries without making some sort of quid pro quo, right? That's the phrase going around with major drug traffickers. They control, and actually in different neighborhoods, MS-13, for example, has been able to local politicians depend on them to bring out the votes, right? In very much the same way that the mafia in the U.S. in the 19...
Kennedy Hall.
Yeah, precisely. So these are dynamics that exist in a lot of different places at different levels, but it's extreme. They govern. They're sovereign entities in their particular territories that they rule, but it's a governance based. This is not like a, this is, if you think about what sort of drove violence during the Cold War era, which you literally had insurgent groups that were trying to challenge the government and pushing a sort of social ideology of more equality. The gangs are also pushing to sort of subsume the government, but there's no identifiable ideology there. This is about ruling through violence, and if it's an ideology, it's an extractive ideology. It's to get as much as we can. And so they challenge the state. They don't want to become the state, but they don't want the state staying out of their business as much as possible. And that's, I think, precisely if you think about migration flows and why people leave. The governments in these regions do not have a monopoly over the use of violence. And so these gangs and other organized criminal groups step in to, at first, to take care of security for their own people. Gangs started as like private security for the poor in places that have been totally abandoned by the state. Over time, they morphed into something much, much more damaging and predatory than what they began. But that's probably the saddest part of the story, is that they started out as trying to protect the hood. That was the whole point. But transformed into something much, much worse and spread like wildfire across the country. Yeah?
What, if anything, has our government done either in the past that you would consider effective in any way to change, mitigate the situation compared to what's happened recently?
Right.
Probably, I assume
Yeah.
it's just gotten a lot worse.
It has gotten a lot worse, but that's a great. I like that posing of the question, because most of it's like, what are we supposed to do about this now? But so, for example, in the story of Otto Perez Molina, the president who was deeply linked to these imprisoned war criminals and so on and so forth. There's a group called CICIG. I always get the acronym wrong, but
International Commission.
Yeah, what is it? International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. Thank you. And so it was a UN body. The biggest donor was the U.S., along with some European countries. And it was a UN body that was brought in 2007 by President Colom to essentially try to resolve the deep-seated structural impunity enjoyed by the most elite powers, from drug traffickers, but also the elite families that own the banks and all the businesses. Essentially, they had to strengthen the Attorney General's office and make prosecuting crimes that involve powerful entities possible. And they made a sea change, pushed a sea change that ended up backfiring on them, and I'll explain that in a second. But the U.S. was the biggest backer. They did cases. One of the cases, they revealed a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme from the president's office all the way down to customs agents on the border, where they were skimming millions of dollars from imports and so on and so forth. That ended up leading to protests that ousted President Molina in 2015. President Molina, Perez Molina, had wanted to get rid of this group for obvious reasons before that all happened. But Joe Biden and the Obama administration said, you do that, we pull funding for Guatemala. Fast forward 2 years later to Jimmy Morales, who's a new president. He's kind of like a mini Trump. He's a TV personality, right? He did blackface at some point. I mean, it's the resonances between these two guys is hilarious. He threatens the same thing, and U.S. is totally mum. It's gone now. They've lost their mandate, and the pueblo, the people of Guatemala, very much, they know the score. They know this is the only backing they have against sort of the people who have basically been in charge of the country. The entities have been in charge of the country from the Cold War onwards. But long story short, in answering your question, just that support given to that body made changes that no one thought was possible happen fairly quickly through some very high-profile things. So that's one example. So that, and it's interesting how tied and it's literally just a nod from the U.S., right, or silence that can make or break those sorts of programs. There's also USAID has run a lot of. I've done some assessment of sort of I'm trying to go after the gang problems in Honduras in these very peaceful, clever ways of helping people take back public spaces. But it's the problem is it's not done on a scale that makes it actually meaningful. And these are maybe 4 or 5, 6 year programs. When any real change is going to happen in Central America, this problem is at least. The U.S. has supported the wrong people in these countries for 50 years at least. It's going to take another 50 years of supporting the right people to actually make real change possible. So, and democratic politics don't work on that scale, especially for foreign aid. Over here and then over there.
So how involved are these gangs involved in the drug trafficking to the U.S.? And so when you were there, did they mention any communication with drug trafficking organizations in Mexico or?
Right. So the gangs, as I said, despite their spectacle and their visibility, are very much at the low end of organized crime. Their main business up to this point is extortion. And extortion makes them really unpopular. And you can imagine extortion is sort of the most hated and feared crime, and it drives a lot of the northward migration. Protection rackets, right?
You go to a neighborhood guy and you say something will happen to your business if you don't.
Exactly. Someone gets a new new coat of paint on their house, and like, oh, this guy must have money. We're gonna go ask for more money from him, right? Or everyone in the neighborhood has to pay in, and it's oftentimes like the ambulance. Tortilla, the grandma selling tortillas, right? So that literally, from protecting these neighborhoods, they came to actually predating upon them, right? Only in Honduras has MS-13 sort of reached up to a high level of being able to take a major part in urban distribution networks of cocaine and marijuana, right? The actual movement of the drug cartels don't really want to have much to do with the likes of Mano Salvatrucha and Valle 18 because they bring the heat, right? They're not trustworthy enough. They are too involved and sort of embedded in these feuds against each other. A lot of them have tattoos, right? That's not good. That doesn't keep you undercover, right? So drug cartels tend to try to keep as quiet keep the lid on major violence. Now that dynamic is changing. Long story short, they haven't really entered into being major international traffickers. Those major international traffickers are, they operate on I don't have images here, but they operate on a totally different sort of geographical scale, and their entrance in the government is also much, much more higher level. And they certainly are linked up with primarily the Sinaloa cartel. The Zetas tried to make an entrance into Guatemala, and it was just fascinating. They did so with a number of spectacular massacres that and challenged local drug trafficking families in a major way. And what's interesting about that is that the Guatemalan government, who is, drug traffickers have operated in Guatemala since the 70s at least, they were able to go after and arrest and kick out the Zetas like that. And not exactly like that, but over a process of about a year, the Zetas lost their foothold there. So showing that when they really want to get a drug trafficking organization, they can. But because it was the pinche Mexicanos, right, coming in and trying to take over Guatemalan business, right, and so it shows to me it shows actually how much collusion there is between local drug trafficking families and the government, because when someone else tries to come in and hoard in on the business, it doesn't work out, right? So to answer, I think to answer your question, the other part of that is. As it was told, that one of the reasons it's so hard understanding drug trafficking in Central America is that, as a policeman who works for the DA said, they're only the tail of the dragon. The head is in Mexico. So they work for and have some autonomy, but essentially take their orders from Mexican cartels, meaning that it's very difficult to try to pick apart the dynamics by just having a purely Central American lens. Yeah.
Just your insights about the kind of reverse of the question before, how the state kind of turns on and off when it suits them,
right.
These spectacles that you're talking about and how that's put to use.
Right.
And then a little different question, when the Maras call for an end to impunity or no more violent, what are they, what in their world does that mean?
Yeah, right, exactly. So, yeah, how the state turns it on and turns it off. The state has made the number of things. One, the gangs have made it become the perfect excuse for the remilitarization of society and from the remilitarization of the approach to security after the end of the Cold War. Right, the militaries of Guatemala and El Salvador, following the atrocities that were outed of what they had committed over 15 to 30 year period, really made them lose prestige. In the peace accords, 2/3 of the military was disbanded in Guatemala. Salvador, I don't know the precise numbers, but it was something similar. So they were sort of on the back foot, right? And the gangs became this perfect entrance to say, the police can't do this. We need a mano dura, right? The strong fist approach. And it allowed the military to kind of to re-burnish their image and come in with this militarized approach that took precisely from anti-insurgency activities of going after entire communities where gangs are supposed to be. So this sort of the same sort of drain the sea to drown the fish, right? Scorched earth campaigns is essentially what the approach to security has been, and they rely precisely on their own spectacle. There's sort of a war of spectacle between and you see this in Mexico as well, right? The shock and awe campaigns. The bunch of arrested mareros or drug traffickers looking down with all these like drugs and guns in front of them, right? That's the counterpart to hanging bodies and decapitated heads and so on and so forth. And your second question was...
So you have the notes being left around, no more impunity.
Right.
And who's
Right.
that called?
Yeah, who's that called? And that's a really good question. And I think, these...
And the backdrop for other people in the room is that those are the calls often against why aren't these unsolved deaths, which in many cases are in fact attributable to Maras. That's part of the why is there impunity, why are those people protected? So the Maras are calling for that.
I mean, it was precisely, they had made a deal with prison authorities to get La Visita going again, and after negotiations and so on and so forth, and then the government reneged. Right, so that's in a very limited sense. I think in a broader sense, and that's one of the questions I had: is are they just sort of drawing from scripts that are floating around, and this has become the language of resistance, and this is how you couch a complaint? And at the same time, I think in terms of living with insecurity, nobody lives with more insecurity than a gang member. It is the highest level, the speed with which people die. At young ages. And so I think, if anything, they are at the very sort of center of the maelstrom and have more reason than anyone to kind of want things to be secure. I think becoming part of a gang is to try to gain some sense of security, right? So, I mean, that goes a little meta with your question, but I think if we understand from that perspective that everyone's just trying to carve out some way to keep themselves safe. And in gang-dominated neighborhoods, you see that too. Like, you don't want to become part of the gang, but you can't be seen as being against them. So how do you kind of dance that line, knowing that your family, the police, no one's going to protect you? How does a young person, between 10 and 15 years old, sort of carve out, you're friends with somebody in there, but you don't want to get recruited into it, but if you're friends, maybe your family won't get extorted, etc. So it's this constant game of trying to, that is caused by just levels of unprecedented levels of impunity. So maybe that's what they really feel in their hearts, but I don't know. We good? What? I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
It was interesting to me how crucial women's roles were in all of this. Were you able to talk with any women, or? Right.
Thank you for asking that question. I mean, it's something it is very male-centric work. It ended up being very male-centric. I haven't subsequent work been able to, but one of the reasons is, so my primary connections are through prison. Prisoners depend deeply upon their female companionship, the women on the outside who will take care of them. These guys spend so much time wooing, right? Like becoming, figuring out how to draw women to them, getting numbers, they're like, they have a whole, how do I say this? There's like it's a survival mechanism, but it's also just to have some sort of connection on the outside means that monetarily you can survive, but it goes well beyond that. Those relationships are really fraught for obvious reasons. I mean, relationships are hard in general, right? But when you're separated by walls, like, it's very, very difficult. In this research, I didn't want to, since these guys were my main contacts, I did, and the politics of sexuality too, being a white gringo rich person, middle class individual, I did not want to disturb that dynamic at all, or give anyone reason to question my motives, motives of the female partners and so on and so forth. Subsequent research, I have delved into that angle more, and I've written some articles about it as well. But for when this was happening, it was very limited, which I think is a real weakness, because I think it's understanding understanding the role of women as important agents in making all this hold together. Like, literally, the prison system, to my mind, is held up on the backs of these women. Like, they keep the whole thing from falling apart. If they didn't play that vector of that constant connection between the inside and outside, the whole system itself would no longer survive. So, but it's as a male researcher, is one of the things that I ran up against during this time. Yeah. Yeah. Good. All right. Thank you all.